Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about ACT for Emotion Dysregulation with Dr. Patricia Zurita Ona, author of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy for Borderline Personality Disorder. Patricia, or Dr. Z, is a psychologist specializing in working with and creating compassionate, research-based, and actionable resources for overachievers and overthinkers to get them unstuck from worries, fears, anxiety, perfectionism, procrastination, obsessions, and ineffective playing it safe actions. She is founder of the East Bay Therapy Center, a boutique practice where she offers therapy and coaching services based on acceptance and commitment therapy and contextual behavioral science. She has been nominated as a fellow of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science for her contributions to the applications of ACT to specific fear-based struggles. Hi, Patricia. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start out by just asking, what is emotion regulation?
That's a hot question and it's a hot topic. When we think about emotion regulation, many researchers and academicians have agreed that it's the intentional effort to suppress, avoid, or replace an uncomfortable emotion and to then act based on the emotion. So, for example, if you're feeling really mad, you may have urges to slam a door or scream or disconnect. So emotion regulation captures that process of acting quickly on the emotion and doing what the emotion asks you to do. Because we're all the time sensing and feeling, imagine how many emotions we have throughout the day. So every person, every single human being, every person walking on earth is all the time regulating the responses to their emotions.
What are some common misconceptions you see about emotion regulation?
Oh, so many. I think, where do I start with that question? Oh my goodness.
Just an easy one.
Yeah, I love it. I think sometimes we think that emotion regulation, it's a binary construct, whether you have emotion regulation or you don't have emotion regulation. But that's really far from the truth because emotion regulation is more like a continuum of responses that you have throughout your day. You experience different types of emotions. Some emotions are fleeting. Some emotions are pleasurable based. Some emotions are very painful. Some emotions are very, very scary. And based on the intensity of each emotion and what is happening in your environment, you are choosing to respond, or you're doing the best you can to manage those emotions. So I don't think this construct of emotion regulation as something that person either has it or not. It's more like a continuum, right? We have different degrees of responses to the different emotional experiences we go through during the day. So I think that's a big misconception. Emotion regulation has usually been associated with borderline personality disorder, but I am a big proponent that emotion regulation, it is a transdiagnostic process across multiple struggles. You don't have to have borderline personality disorder or BPD to be struggling with your emotions. You can be dealing with panic. You can be dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder. You can be dealing with chronic worry, and you are still dealing with emotion regulation difficulties. Well, I think, that is a big clarification, right? Another misconception of dealing with emotion regulation difficulties is that every time you are engaging in an avoidant response, or you're suppressing or trying to change the course of an emotion, that by nature is absolutely wrong. Within acceptance and commitment therapy, we think of responses not too much in terms of what is right or what is wrong, but in terms of what is useful or helpful for this person or unhelpful in a given context. So, for example, if a person is participating in a conversation, like you and I in this moment, and I suddenly hear about a dead animal, I may have the thought, I don't want to think about it. Because if I think about this dead animal, I will be very frustrated, I will be very sad, and I will be removed from our conversation. So sometimes we can notice these feelings and we may try to refocus them, right? Or refocus from them. But not all the time that we're trying to alter the course of an emotion means that it's absolutely wrong. In some high stake situations, like being in combat or you are in war, right? You sometimes have to disentangle from your emotions in order to be able to make an effective response. So that's another misconception. The frame that I'm holding based on acceptance and commitment therapy is that number one, every single human being on earth is regulating to their emotions. Every person is doing that. Let me say that again. The frame I'm holding based on acceptance and commitment therapy is that every single person is regulating their responses to their emotions. But what makes a behavioral response effective or not, it's the context, the situation they are exposed to. So I think that is very, very important for people listening to us, that we cannot quickly assume that when a person is trying to change the course of an emotion, that's absolutely wrong. It's context based.
Yeah, I actually experienced this when I was going through cancer treatment last year. I found that I kind of was just not necessarily avoidant, but I was putting off feeling the emotions of the diagnosis until after treatment. And I wasn't expecting it to be so hard post treatment for me emotionally. Whereas I thought going through it, I would feel sort of the deepest emotions, but it wasn't until after where I was able to process it. So it was like survival mode, not allowing me to process those emotions that I was going through.
Mm-hmm. There you go. There you go. Thank you for sharing that. That's a experience that a lot of people will relate to, in which at times, in order to make an effective decision, pay attention to the doctors, look at the medications, spending time with the people you love, right? You may want to choose which emotions you're going to put them in the background and which emotions you want to focus on, right? The challenge is that I think a lot of people don't know that. And I think sometimes of some people as being more like super feelers. They feel too much, too quick, and they act too soon. So when the emotion comes, they quickly do what the emotion asks them and tells them to do. In your case, you were very thoughtful and savvy to distinguish, right? When am I going to dive into this emotion, at what time, and when I have to step back. So that's what emotion regulation skills is about. It's really helping us to step back, disentangle from all the noise that shows up, and check in this moment, in this situation, what is important to me. If I act on this emotion, is that going to expand my life or is going to shrink it? Will I become the person I want to be or not in this particular moment?
That's the piece where ACT comes in. And I'd love to hear more about how ACT can help with both emotion regulation and borderline personality disorder specifically.
Yeah, there have been many studies over the years looking at applications of ACT for BPD and for emotion regulation struggles in general. Again, I think within the ACT community, a lot of people will agree that emotional regulation is a process across many, many struggles: substance abuse, eating disorders, anxiety, mood disorders, neurocognitive struggles. I think one of the biggest contributions within ACT to emotional regulation has been understanding that a person's response is always based in context. Within ACT, we like to talk about context sensitivity, which I think deconstruct a little bit these paradigms of good and bad or disorders versus a person that doesn't have BPD, right? I think we try to understand all the time these responses in context. In one of the books that I work with you guys, I have this long definition of emotional regulation. So I will just break it down in pieces for our audience to be maybe more clear about that, because I think that will help us to understand what we're dealing with. When we're thinking about emotional regulation with ACT lenses, we're thinking of a person that has high degrees of fusion with language-based content, which means that they're completely entangled with a lot of thoughts that are coming into their mind, in particular ruling thoughts or rules about their emotions. Because I feel this very strongly means it's important. Because I feel this means I have to do something about this emotion right now. Or this emotion is never going to end. It's always going to be so intense. So a person has high degrees of fusion, in particular with ruling thoughts about the emotional experience. They also have high degrees of experiential avoidance. I don't want to feel, I don't want to sense, I don't want to go there. I need to run away from this. The combination of high degrees of fusion and high degrees of experiential avoidance led a person to engage in what we call unworkable behaviors. I do the things that take me farther away from the person I want to be. And in the case of BPD, but also in the case of any person struggling with emotion regulation, these responses have been overgeneralized across situations. I show up like this to work, to my friends, to my relatives, to the religious service that I go on the weekends, and they have been reinforced in different settings. So we think of BPD as a chronic pattern of unworkable behaviors driven by high degrees of fusion and experiential avoidance about emotional content. That sounds very, very jargony, so I apologize for that. But that's just to clarify that I think within ACT, more than thinking of labels and diagnosis, we're always looking at the processes. Behind BPD, behind emotion regulation, what you have is the process again of fusion and avoidance, primarily focused on emotional content, and a pattern of behaviors that have been overgeneralized across settings and reinforced throughout the person's life. So I think clarifying that, thinking of emotional regulation as a universal struggle, not exclusive of a group, and getting out of the label and looking more at the process, I think has destigmatized a lot of what we're thinking of BPD. So I think that's one of the biggest contributions. And certainly there are many, many studies that have shown the effectiveness and efficacy of ACT for this particular group of people.
Yeah, I love that, taking it out of the diagnosis and learning about sort of the workings behind it. I think that can better serve folks who are experiencing that dysregulation. And earlier you mentioned super feelers. I just want to go back to that for a second. Is that a term that's commonly used with BPD, or is that another sort of transdiagnostic term that you see across multiple diagnoses?
It's a great question. So when you look at the literature on BPD and emotion regulation, maybe from 40 years ago and not too far ago, like maybe 10 years ago, it's extremely stigmatizing. The literature has labeled these clients that I call them as super feelers as manipulators, attention seeking, resistant. There have been so many labels. The challenge is that when you look at the person through the lenses of the label, is that not only you forget their humanity, it's like it's hard to relate to their struggles, right? So it's hard to be compassionate with a person that is suffering in front of you when you're just looking at them. They are resistant and they are manipulative. So in my experience working with clients with emotion regulation and different types of emotion regulation, it was important for me to find a way to capture that experience. And the experience is that they are just prone to feel a lot, right? They don't want it, but they are prone biologically to feel a lot, too much, too quick, too soon. So I will usually talk about a person being a super feeler because I think it's much more compassionate. It's really acknowledging a person's proneness without judging them as something being bad with them or they are broken. So I think a lot of people these days are referring to them as super feelers. I started that in one of the books that I work, Escaping the Emotional Roller Coaster. And then I continue with that in the other book with a protocol for emotional regulation.
Yeah, I really like that term. So, when working with clients, why is it important for clinicians to help clients discriminate the different emotional states and why that matters?
Mm-hmm. This wonderful researcher and academician, Lisa Feldman, she wrote the book, What Emotions Are Made Of. And she is the one that talks about this concept that is called emotional granularity, which means basically unpacking an emotion, peeling an emotion into all the components it has. It has sensations, it has a feeling, a name that we give it to it. It has an urge, there are thoughts associated with emotion. And when we experience high intense emotions, very often we will say things like, oh my gosh, this is too much. I can handle this. Especially me. I say that all the time.
Me too.
Oh my gosh. But when you go into unpacking an emotional experience and you say things like, I am noticing butterflies in my stomach. I am sensing my legs shaking right now. I have this urge to disconnect right now. That's what is called emotional granularity, is unpacking these micro components of emotion. When you do that, when you can describe those different components of an emotional experience, then you are stepping back a little bit, you're zooming out, and then you can choose your response. So emotional granularity gives you the space for you to check again how you want to respond to the emotion. I know for people listening to us, they may be thinking that's a bunch of baloney. It's impossible to do that because that's what my clients have told me, right? And I get it. It feels impossible many times to choose our behavior when we're feeling a lot. And yet, not only science shows us that, but I want to encourage people to try that. When we help our clients to unpack their emotional experience, they will start practicing the muscle of choosing over and over how I want to respond to this situation or to this feeling. So that's one of the ways to help clients to unpack these emotional experiences. And Lisa Feldman talks a lot about that when describing emotional granularity.
Well, and it's probably important to practice those skills, especially when you're not heightened, so that in those moments of high emotion, you're able to better separate yourself from that immediate, intense feeling.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think many times we try to teach clients these skills when they are already struggling, right? But the idea is to actually teach them in situations that are not emotionally charged, right? Usually, there is the curriculum that we have is a 16-week curriculum that can be used in group settings or individual treatment. And basically, in the emotional awareness module that includes 5 sessions, every session clients are learning to notice their emotional experience. We start by teaching them what we call these fleeting emotions, the emotions that come and go. What am I doing tonight? Do I want to watch this movie or do I want to go to hang out with my friend, right? Sometimes there's this feeling emotions, and sometimes there, again, emotions are a little bit heavier. So in every session, we're teaching clients to know these different emotional states, including emotions that they are scared of, emotions they don't like to feel, some of the emotions that are so-called positive emotions and that sometimes drive problematic behaviors. So it's all about checking the different emotional states that you go through in situations that are not overly charged. And then we're teaching them always this moment that they have to choose when emotion shows up, right? And there are different ways to call this moment. But when you step back with emotional experience and you check again, what are my options right now and what's workable? So we have a roadmap that we give to clients, and it's a little worksheet, but it's basically teaching clients to break down the emotional experience and really check how they want to respond to it. We also teach clients about some of these more painful emotions like fears of loneliness, fears of rejection, fears of abandonment, that they have usually a different qualities, right? If I'm afraid of taking the elevator, absolutely very scary. Of course, what if I get trapped? What if I get stuck? But there are also other emotions that are related to our sense of self, to our sense of connection, to that sense of intimacy we want to have in life, like the fears of rejection, abandonment. So we also slowly in the curriculum teach clients to dive into these emotional states all the time in no very charged situations. But as the curriculum progresses, we actually go to situations that can be very triggering for people. But we don't start there, of course.
Yeah, exactly. One piece of the book and the curriculum that I found interesting was you talk about the difference between a gut reaction and true awareness. Can you say more about that and why it's important for clients to understand the difference between the two?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. When the emotional switch goes on and a super feeler is, experiencing the emotion at a high level, quite likely that emotion is going to come with a lot of directions. Do this, say that, you cannot take it, blah, 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 a lot of noise, right? And it feels as if all those thoughts are the absolute truth. That's why we talk about high degrees of fusion. But many times, if we step back from that noise and we look within a little bit, intentionally slowing down, there is a soft voice within each one of us, a soft voice that it can be called as the wise voice. It can be called as your transcendent self if you want. But this soft voice is not demanding. It's not pushing. It shows you what's the behavior that could be helpful in that moment. It shows you how you want to show up in that situation. It's the metaphor I like to use is imagine that you go to a concert of heavy metal, Megadeth, right? It's like loud, it's on your face, it's out there. And imagine that you go to a concert of classical music. It's soft, it's not demanding. So this true wisdom that we have is a little more like that all of us have. It just gets cloudy and noisy, right? But if you tap into the soft voice, the true wisdom, you know how to show up. The rest of the stuff is noise. I think again that the noise that comes with emotions, the noise in our head makes it hard for us. But if we really step back, we are going to find this soft, non-demanding voice that shows us what's the way. So I think that's another skill to cultivate when you're working with emotion regulation.
I love that metaphor of the concerts. I think that makes it really easy to understand the difference between the two. We'll be right back after this short break.
I'm Dr. Lindsay Gibson, author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. Growing up with emotionally immature parents can affect their adult children in several ways. Most of all, it affects the child's ability to trust themselves as adults and to see themselves as people of value who have healthy entitlements to respect and their own individuality. So join me on this adventure of self-discovery. For more details, go to adultchildrencourse.com.
New Harbinger online courses, self-help for everyone. Another concept I thought was interesting was the concept of chronic emotions. Can you talk about what those are and where those sort of come from?
Yeah. When I think about these chronic emotions, I was thinking about these heavy feelings like social rejection, abandonment, being like a failure many times, and certainly in some cases, people have very painful experiences when growing up with their caregivers or with their families. There is, I think, a lot of research showing that. There is also times in which people may have wonderful families that are very caring and very loving, but they are not necessarily emotionally attuned with a person's needs. So I call them chronic emotions because they're very repetitive, right? Different models have talked about this experience. You have a schema therapy, you have emotion focused therapy, diving into these very deep feelings. I think they are chronic in the sense that they are through a person's history. These big feelings are not from one day to another day. They are through a person's history since they were children, teenagers. Sometimes in my work, I do what I call the lifeline exercise when we are mapping. Do you remember when you were a kid? Were there any moments when you experienced this fear of being abandoned? And people will tell you, I remember when I was 7 years old and this happened at the school, or when I went to this party. So they are chronic because they have been consistent to a person's life, right? And then we map all the responses that this person did to manage that emotion. Very different than these other fleeting feelings, right? Do I feel like having dark chocolate, or should I have like, I don't know, chia pudding? Very different feeling, right? But these chronic emotions are really embedded in a person's history. And because of that, because they have been sometimes reinforced, they have been generalized in different situations, they can be much more painful. They can also be triggered sometimes out of the blue, right? I cannot tell you how many times I have here moments in which people may go to a dinner and then they are having dinner, they're having a great time, and then suddenly they look at someone and they see what the persons look at them in a way that they didn't expect. And boom, this big feeling of rejection gets activated, right? So I think in the work of emotion regulation, it's important to distinguish those feelings, especially with the super feelers, because those are the biggest emotions that are going to primarily affect the relationships. They deeply want to connect. They deeply want to feel love and learn to love. It just happens that emotions cloud a little bit what's happening and makes it harder for them. So diving into those emotions, super important.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe another term that we see often with that is core wounds. But I like the chronic emotions better because again, it sort of changes it from this negative connotation of wounds into emotion. So I like what you're doing there. You also talk about the inner voice. Can we talk about what that is and what are the four main qualities of that inner voice?
Mm-hmm. I think within acceptance and commitment therapy, as you know, we talk a lot about the fusion and unhooking from our mind and not taking our mind so seriously. And I can tell you personally and professionally, learning about the fusion has made a significant change in my life. Um, I sound like a preacher sometimes, but I really say that it's like learning ACT has completely changed my life, like in incredible ways. I feel so grateful to that community of ACT practitioners. But I also think as a clinician working full time that this idea of stepping back from our mind and practicing the fusion, it feels so foreign. It feels so foreign to almost every client I have worked with. We are living in the information era. We're living at the time in which there is driverless cars. We're living at the time in which we have been told that every single thing we think defines us, right? Just as Descartes said, right? Because I think, therefore I exist. So I think even in California, in which there is a lot of, I think, practitioners of mindfulness and different approaches, it still is a foreign concept for people to step back from their minds, to learn that their mind has a life on its own, that the mind is all the time going on and on and on. For us, because we have drink the Kool-Aid, it feels so natural to say, I need to watch this thought, right? And it's really cool that we do that. But for the lay audience, I think it's such a foreign concept. So one of the ways, and there are so many ways to introduce this, I like to talk about this inner voice as really acknowledging that every time we are awake and we're breathing and our eyes are open and they're also closed, our inner voice, our mind keeps going on and on, 24/7, yap, 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 chop, 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 never stopping. It's a metaphor to really learn to see the mind has a life on its own and that we don't have control of it. Why this is important? Because when a person experiences a high intense emotions, quickly the mind will jump with all types of things. If a person doesn't know how to disentangle from those thoughts, they are going to act quickly in the emotion and perpetuate the pain. Right? So I think teaching them that the mind has a life on its own and learning to really watch those thoughts is very important. If I can add a little bit, when we're teaching the curriculum, one of the most well-received sessions is when we talk about the inner voice and the rules about fighting and the rules about attachment. Keep in mind that I really believe in this. I think for super feelers, right? They are really, they want to experience connection and intimacy. But when you have an emotional switch that goes on and off anytime, anywhere, no matter who you are with, it can be very painful. It can be very painful. So in one of the lessons, we talk about these go-to fighting tactics. Do you going to go tick for tack? Do you going to disconnecting? Do you going to blame me? And we talk about how the inner voice has come up with rules, right? I need to be the person saying the last word always. There are winners and losers in a fight, right? So those are just examples about how the inner voice has come up with different rules about how to deal with conflict. It is very different when we talk about and we say, okay, there is these misconceptions about fights versus telling a client, let's just step back a little bit. When you were in pain because a person told you something that was hard to hear, your inner voice was trying to manage that. What did your inner voice do? What did your inner voice come up with? It's a more compassionate approach to teach clients that when they are in pain, of course their mind is going to come up with different ways to make sense of that pain. One of the ways to make sense of the painful experience is by coming up with rules. Rules about how to handle the fight, rules about how to handle the person in front of me that is hurting me, right? So very different, right? The first approach is perhaps more didactic. These are the misconceptions, winners and losers. But the other one really helps a person to step back and acknowledge again the complexity of being a human and how bold it is for a super feeler to be walking in a world in which they are prone to feel a lot with a mind that tells them a lot too.
Mm-hmm. One thing that helped me when my mind was sort of spinning all of these rules or emotions was my therapist told me to step back and to like thank that anxiety because all it was trying to do, even if unhelpful, was trying to protect me. And I found that to be really helpful. At first, it seemed like hokey to like talk to my anxiety, but it actually did something for me and really helped sort of reframe those thoughts and emotions that were coming through.
That's really, really cool. I'm so glad that you had a flavor of that, how it looks to really, do this diffusion thing, right? How it means to disentangle from thoughts. And there is a bunch of things you may have tried, like visualizing thoughts, physicalizing thoughts, saying some of these thoughts aloud. But I think what is important more than the technique of diffusion is really the process of stepping back, just as your therapist encouraged you to do, right? I think this is one of the struggles with ACT. It's such an experiential approach, and it's so exciting to be doing these exercises. And I think also as a clinician, we have to be careful what we're modeling for clients. Are we modeling for clients the use of that technique? Or we're modeling for clients the process of stepping back, the process of living with vitality, the process of opening up to my feelings. So I think that is also important when working with emotion regulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one piece of your book that I really loved was your nerdy thoughts sidebars. And I want to ask you the one that really stood out to me that you talked about, which does ACT change thoughts?
Thank you for, it's so funny, but when the book got published, I got many messages, love the nerdy comments. Well, behind every book, right, I have read so many research articles, but that book was over 400 research articles that I had to read. So I was fully immersed. And then when I finished with all these articles, I was like, there's no way I'm going to let them go. I need to have them in the book. So the nerdy comments was a way to do it. This really cool question, does ACT change thoughts? So much have say about it, right? I think when you look at the evolution of evidence-based therapies, and we have the first wave of behaviorists, the second wave of cognitive behavior therapy, in which we are really challenging thoughts and reframing thoughts. And then we have these third wave approaches in which we're teaching clients more skills of mindfulness and acceptance and transcendent self and valued living. The question taps into one of the big differences, right? The big difference between the second wave and the third wave. In a second wave, and I have been trained on the second wave as a hardcore cognitive behavior therapist. I remember many times looking at my own thoughts and searching for the evidence for and evidence against a thought. And I had very long thought logs. My goodness, my thought logs were so long. But that was the model, right? It was really questioning the veracity, questioning if a thought is factual or not. The challenge is that the mind has a life on its own, and it's impossible to win our mind. Some thoughts are helpful, a lot of thoughts are unhelpful. And the path of challenging thoughts, while could be helpful for sometimes maybe minor situations, it can be really, really a slippery road for more rumination and negative thinking for a lot of clients. So ACT, that was a long response, a long background response to your question. So I think ACT doesn't target directly thoughts as CBT will do, right? You don't see an ACT practitioner looking at the evidence for and evidence against. However, the change happens by experience. When people experience different aspects of life, when they experience values-based living, when they experience how to make room for uncomfortable feelings, new thoughts sometimes emerge, right? So sometimes people are going to describe a change in their beliefs. They are going to establish new relationships, new thinking relationships based on the experience. But ACT by itself doesn't target that directly. But yes, I think ACT has been criticized as never changing thoughts. That is not true. It just happens that it's not the direct target. The general understanding is that when people has different experiences, then of course your sometimes your beliefs are going to be shifting naturally. And I have seen that hundreds of times doing exposure-based treatments for clients with social anxiety, OCD, also with my clients with perfectionism, right? It just happened that the focus of the treatment is not to change the thoughts. Sometimes some people will change some thoughts. Some thoughts are resistant to change. But that doesn't mean that a person cannot experience a sense of joy and vitality in their life. I'm thinking, for example, when you are working with body image concerns or body image disorder, those thoughts are very resistant to change, right? And that's across research. However, a person can learn other ways to manage the pain that comes with walking with a body that they didn't choose. So I think a lot of times beliefs may change in their own. Sometimes they may not. It just happens that it's unfair to say that act doesn't change thoughts, right? That's all. It's not that it's absolute thing.
Yeah. And before we wrap up too, I want to ask about the role of the body. What role does the body play in regulating emotions? And what are some tools that ACT offers for noticing how your body's doing?
Well, so much to say about that. Perhaps the shortest response in the context of emotion regulation is to acknowledge that our body can be like a bridge between all the stuff that we go through inside and what's happening in the world outside. There's a lot of overthinking struggles like worry, rumination, that really more like avoidance of what's happening in our body, right? The tension we're feeling or the emotions we're sensing in a given moment. So I think the shorter response will be to think that the body is a bridge between what happens inside under a person's skin and what's happening outside, and how the body can be capitalized to help a person to center themselves, to anchor themselves, to ground themselves. There are many skills and many books written about stress that have used diaphragmatic breathing, grounding, looking at 5 things, describing 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, and on and on. I think in addition to that, because we also teach clients those skills, I invite my clients many times to notice with their bodies what acceptance looks and feels and what restriction looks and feels in their body. I think many times, right, we are resisting emotional experience in our head, right? I don't want to go there. It's not for me right now. And yes, sometimes that's helpful, other times not. But also our bodies experiencing emotional restriction and emotional openness. So sometimes we practice with clients that. I think that is super important because we are also, we cannot isolate our bodies from our experiences. So in addition to the classic distress tolerance, I like to teach my clients to notice how acceptance looks and feels in their body, to know just how restriction feels and sound. I also like to teach my clients other skills like when they are experiencing an intense emotion, how can the body help them to anchor themselves? If I am this conversation, I'm getting triggered, I cannot just disconnect from the call. I cannot just bolt the room, right? But I may do other things, right? One soft thing is I can place one hand on my stomach and I intentionally kind of slow down my breathing. The other one, I can place my hand on the back of my neck. As I'm talking to you, I can press my fingertips on the back of my neck and massage my neck a little bit. I can press my feet really firmly and hard against the floor to anchor myself. The idea here is not to teach clients that every time you're getting anxious, you have to use these skills. It's to remind them that in a given situation, they have to choose what is more important to you, right? And what is important for me in this moment is to be present with you. Therefore, I want to intentionally do the best I can to focus on this conversation. And that means sometimes helping myself with my body to do that. So it's not about using these stress tolerance skills to get rid of the emotion. It's intentionally choosing to anchor with my body to be present. So I think the frame of teaching these stress tolerance skills is also important. Otherwise, it can be used as another avoidance strategy.
Yeah, I really like that. And the skills you just offered are so simple and very discreet too, that you can do in the moment. So it doesn't have to be a big ordeal of what you're doing with your body. Like you said, just like touching your neck and like grounding your feet. You can do those without anyone else even being aware that you're doing that.
That's right. That's right. I think one of the biggest questions I have gotten from my clients many times, they will say things like, "Dr. Z, the session goes so well. I like it, blah blah. But when I go to the work, what do I do?" Right? When they are with their kids screaming at them, when you are with a manager that is giving you terrible feedback, when you are with your friend who is struggling, how do you manage those moments, right? I like to talk about sometimes mindfulness on the go. I think our days, right? There are micro things that we can do to really anchor ourselves. We don't have the time to go to a 10-hour retreat every single day in our life, especially in the information era. And yet, these micro things like grounding, pressing our feet, slowing down our breath, massaging our neck, or massaging sometimes the area between close to your thumbs, it's going to help you to anchor yourself.
Yeah, on the go. I like that. Patricia, that feels like a good place for us to wrap up unless you have any final thoughts for the listeners.
Well, first, of course, I want to say thank you so much for having me in the podcast. I love what you guys are doing. I think it's really, really cool to put some audio content out there. And I do want to encourage people listening to us that being a super feeler doesn't mean that the person is broken. It just really means they have an emotional switch that goes on and off anytime. And they are science-based and compassionate skills that a person can learn to have incredible, rich lives. That will be my biggest takeaway message for people.
Motivate your BPD clients with values-based treatment. This 16-week ACT protocol will help you get started today. As you know, clients with borderline personality disorder, BPD, and emotion dysregulation often struggle with negative beliefs about themselves, beliefs that can lead to feelings of shame, problems with personal relationships, and dangerous behaviors. And while dialectical behavioral therapy is a standard treatment for BPD, more and more acceptance and commitment therapy has shown promising results when treating BPD clients by helping them focus on their core values and forgiveness. Acceptance and commitment therapy for borderline personality disorder provides a comprehensive program for delivering ACT to clients with BPD. Using the session-by-session 16-week protocol in this professional guide, you can help clients work through the main driver behind BPD, experiential avoidance, and gain the psychological flexibility they need to balance their emotions and begin healing. You can use this protocol on its own or in conjunction with treatment. With this guide, you'll learn to target the fundamental causes of BPD for better treatment outcomes and happier, healthier clients. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.